will the IMF's expectations be?
His IMF says, well, you've got to bring your budget balance down. The government can't continue to spend a lot more than it earns. And the IMF is clear. They're not asking the government to spend less. They're asking the government to earn more. Okay? The problem is not expenditure. The problem is revenue. They even say, and this is important, that the government should spend on supporting the poor.
Right.
So IMF is keen to see that the government takes social security seriously. We have very high inflation, over 50% inflation right now, year on year. That the poor and those who are falling into poverty are significantly supported. The IMF also, for the first time in a Sri Lankan program, said that it wants the government to take corruption vulnerabilities seriously and work to reduce them. And I think in that sense, the IMF is reflecting the concerns of what we call the Aragale, that corruption is a serious part of why Sri Lanka is in this situation.
As Sri Lanka has plunged into a deep economic crisis, there are many questions as to how Sri Lanka may emerge from these challenging times. Some remain hopeful, but most have lost hope. Today, let's speak to someone who can really tell us what the impending future would look like. Joining me today in conversations with Alanki is Economist and the Executive Director of Verite Research, Dr. Nishan de Mel. Welcome, Dr. de Mel.
Thank you, Alanki.
Dr. de Mel, Sri Lanka was faced with a lot of political instability, but now we have a new president, a new prime minister, and a new cabinet. Do you think the current government can assure the international community to support us?
Alanki, of course, at a time like this, it's very important to have all the assistance you can get. Mm-hmm. I think the international community has been committed to Sri Lanka throughout and expected Sri Lanka to do its own part in helping itself to come out of the crisis, and negotiations and discussions and some work is ongoing, even though it's going slowly. But let's talk about the government, since you asked the question. I think we got into this difficulty of political instability because even though the government had legal validity, it was elected properly, mm-hmm. and the president as well, it had lost popular democratic legitimacy. The approval ratings of the government in nationwide polls done by Verite Research were down to 10% in January and down to 3% in June. So when you lose democratic popular legitimacy, invariably that leads to instability. It's very difficult to maintain government. So the challenge for this government, I think, is that it is not, stability depends on legitimacy. And if this government wins back the popular support of people, and that's the challenge for the new president and the new cabinet, then it will also have stability. But if it doesn't win back popular support, I think you will see this as part of the churn that has been happening, and it will be another step in a continuous set of events that keep politics of the country unstable.
Let's assume that Sri Lanka has to go for an election. So my next question is, can Sri Lanka afford an election?
Yeah, so it's a good question, because I suppose one way of getting stability or legitimacy, really, and legitimacy that leads to stability is to have an election. And you're asking, can we afford it? Let me just share the numbers. Mm-hmm. The presidential election that we had in 2019 cost about 4.4 billion. The general election we had in 2020 was a little more expensive because we had COVID-19 protocols implemented, and that cost about 5.7 billion.
Right.
That's in rupees. But if you look at our budget last year, we allocated about 12 billion rupees for a defense headquarters. We allocated hundreds of billions to build new highways. So all that's in the budget, relatively to what we have allocated for building stuff that can certainly be postponed, the cost of an election is really a fraction of that.
So would you say that Sri Lanka should go for an election, or do you support the idea of forming a national government?
So I think it depends, again, on the legitimacy question. So if Sri Lanka forms a national government, in which everybody believes that the government is taking a path that wins back the support and confidence of people. For instance, it would mean taking very clear, strong action on corruption.
Right.
Now, if you look at the protests that are ongoing, they believe that the corruption of the government is a significant part of why Sri Lanka's economy has tanked as it has. So I think it is about the path that the government lays out. And there is currently a suspicion, as you know, that the current president, Ranil Wickremesinghe, is functioning as a proxy for Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who was the president that people wanted out and who finally resigned. But the current president has a choice. I think he does not have to become a proxy for Gotabaya Rajapaksa. He can act quite independently because the powers of the president give him that ability. And if he shows that he's acting independently and taking action that solve the concerns of people, and corruption would be primary, I think, there is maybe potentially, I think there would additionally be the requirement of people. We did another poll where we asked the question, do you want the executive presidency abolished? 70% said yes. Only 15% said no. So I think the current opposition has tabled or gazetted the 21st Amendment in Parliament to have a pathway to abolish the executive presidency and improve the constitution. But the current president so far, I think, is not trying to go forward with that amendment. He's trying to bring a different constitutional amendment that will not go the distance. So I think really he has a choice. If he accepts the 21st Amendment put forward by the opposition, that may be a basis on which the opposition can support him. If he takes action on corruption, that will be a basis on which he can win back some popular legitimacy. And if he wins back popular legitimacy, which had clearly been lost, then there is also a path to stability.
Right. Moving on to a topic that everyone's been talking about, the IMF. Given that we had preliminary discussions with the IMF, what type of loan is expected to be granted to Sri Lanka? I think, if I'm not mistaken, the central bank governor had assessed the suitability of an external fund facility for Sri Lanka.
Yeah. So the EFF that we are talking about is a longer term loan, which can go up to about $4 billion, but over about 5 years. So Sri Lanka would expect to get about $800 million a year, or $400 million every 6 months, over 4 to 5 years, so 3.2 or 4 billion. I must tell you, Alanki, though, that Sri Lanka's foreign currency shortage is around $800 million a month. So actually, even though people talk about an IMF bailout, there's very little that funding from IMF can do to alleviate the current shortage of currency, because what comes in is maybe 1/12 of what is needed on a regular basis.
All right. Because I think most people are of the view that the IMF can bail out Sri Lanka. IMF alone can bail out Sri Lanka.
Yes. So I think that it should be very clear that certainly the IMF alone cannot do very much in terms of alleviating the situation. What they can do by getting into a program with Sri Lanka is signal confidence. Signal confidence that Sri Lanka has a plan or is on the correct path to recovering its economy. And when you signal confidence and other people trust that Sri Lanka has taken the right steps, that can help unlock other sources of support.
Right.
Which will, I think, still only be limited or partial. It won't meet all the gap that Sri Lanka needs. And let me tell you one more thing, that in coming out of this process, we then look for what you call bridge financing, which is other sources of support that come in on the back of confidence that is built on an IMF program. What really matters is how long do you need it? Okay. If we put fullest energy and focus and resources needed, a lot of countries have solved their debt restructuring problem in 4 to 6 months. Okay, we can do it in 6 months. But if we take a much slower path, as we seem to have done, it could take us a year to 18 months. And any kind of assistance that you get is going to get burnt up at $800 million a month. So you can see that bridge financing or whatever Sri Lanka gets doesn't uh, doesn't compensate for going slow. The best thing that Sri Lanka can do for itself is take a much more focused, speedy approach to completing its debt restructure.
And to have a proper plan in place.
So to do that, you'll need a plan, and you need to win the confidence of the IMF. We can come back to the IMF program, but what I'm saying is that going slow really hurts Sri Lanka's ability to recover, even with the support of others that come on the back of IMF to support Sri Lanka.
So the governor of the central bank is confident that we can overcome the crisis in 5 months, given that Sri Lanka has a stable administration and a clear program. And this is in line with what you said as well. Is this really possible?
So I think it would have been optimistic best to have achieved this in 5 months. But we, as you know, we are still discussing a staff level agreement with the IMF, and there are three, fundamental concerns that are at tension when you're trying to agree on a program with the IMF at this time. The first is urgency. We have a humanitarian disaster. We want to make progress as fast as possible, so you want to be quick. There's an urgency. The second is durability. You want whatever you do right now in terms of a program or a plan to fix the economy to be something that really works.
Right.
Okay, there's two aspects to that. One is, I would say, implementability, because with the IMF, we usually agree on targets. We say we will have a primary surplus in so many years. We will increase revenue to this percentage of GDP. So we set targets and milestones. Implementability means that you have to have a workable plan to make that happen. So sometimes it's easy to set targets. We say, look, I'm going to lose 10 kilos in 3 months. Like, that's a target I can set myself. But do I have a workable plan? Is my lifestyle one in which I am likely to achieve it? Am I committed to that lifestyle? And, am I going to, if I don't, I may not succeed. The second is that it's also the plans that you set must be things that fix your problem long term, right? You may have a plan to lose weight that depends on, short term fasting, but that's not sustainable. And, if you do that for a little while and you get back to life after you lose weight, you're going to put that weight on. So really, are these fixes that are having long-term impact and fixes for the economy? Do we have a plan to implement the fixes that we are talking about? I'll tell you why this conversation is very important. Sri Lanka has been to the IMF 16 times.
Yes.
Now, that means every time we finished a program, we were back very soon in a couple of years with a problem. That means the fixes that we implemented with the IMF weren't long-term fixes. They didn't stick. The economy went back to the problems that it had before a few years after. Secondly, out of those 16 programs, we completed only 7, which means that we made the promises, we set the targets, but we didn't know how to get them done, and we had to admit defeat halfway. So this weight loss analogy might be quite suitable, because we experience that all the time. We don't have a good plan, so we don't complete your weight loss program. Sometimes you do, in a short space of time, lose a lot of weight, but you can't make it stick. So Sri Lanka shouldn't repeat the mistakes it has made for 50, 60 years this time. And so if business as usual, we are at risk of doing a plan that doesn't have a long-term fix, and we are in danger of not being able to complete. And that is sobering. We should take that to heart and say, this time it'll be different.
So what will the IMF's expectations be?
So the IMF set out a press release before, when they left in June, that set out expectations. And there were 2 particular expectations that I think are quite important, interesting apart from the normal stuff. The normal stuff is IMF says, well, you've got to bring your budget balance down. The government can't continue to spend a lot more than it earns. And the IMF is clear. They're not asking the government to spend less. They're asking the government to earn more. Okay. The problem is not expenditure. The problem is revenue. They even say, and this is important, that the government should spend on supporting the poor.
Right.
So IMF is keen to see that the government takes social security seriously. We have very high inflation, over 50% inflation right now, year on year, that the poor and those who are falling into poverty are significantly supported. The IMF also, for the first time in a Sri Lankan program, said that it wants the government to take corruption vulnerabilities seriously and work to reduce them. So whenever the IMF says that it wants something in a program, there's a sort of test for whether it should be included or not. And IMF says, well, is it macro critical? Is it critical for the stability of the macroeconomy that you do this? So when the IMF says we want corruption vulnerabilities addressed, it means they're assessing corruption vulnerabilities as macro critical. And of course, Sri Lanka is not the first place in the world in which it has done that. In many countries, the IMF has made that assessment and had a section of their program dealing with corruption. And I think in that sense, the IMF is reflecting the concerns of what we call the Aragale, that corruption is a serious part of why Sri Lanka is in this situation. Okay. And of course, I told you there were three things that were at tension. So I mentioned urgency, durability. Let me talk about the third to connect the dots. That is acceptability. That there must be, if the program isn't acceptable, it is also becomes hard to sustain it politically.
Right.
That people must see this program as fair. There must be transparency. So acceptability is on one side. Parliament should approve the program or the agreement now, which is what, of course, is worrying. We are talking about getting into a staff level agreement in a matter of weeks. Nobody has seen the agreement outside those negotiating. Parliament has not been provided the agreement.
So there's a lack of transparency.
There is a lack of transparency and people don't know what it is. Now, we also say that Parliament is sovereign over public finance. And yet any agreement you make with the IMF is going to bind public finance of Sri Lanka for 4 or 5 years. So it shouldn't be possible for people or bureaucrats or anyone to negotiate a binding agreement with the IMF that is not actually supported or approved by Parliament. IMF recognizes that as a serious issue for many countries. In fact, it has helped countries like Argentina, Myanmar, etc., pass legislation to make it mandatory that they put before Parliament agreements that they're getting into with the IMF so that the agreement is approved by Parliament prior to sign off. They've done it because in their assessments, they have recognized that one of the reasons that IMF agreements fail, and a quite important reason, is that there is no acceptability, that it fails the third test. And there is no acceptability because there is no transparency, and that's why they've done it. Now, IMF can't force Sri Lankan government to put it to Parliament because there is no law in Sri Lanka that forces that. But IMF highly recommends it. In other parts of the world, they've helped the laws to be developed to that. So in Sri Lanka also, I think it is quite critical that the government rethink the current approach of keeping it, behind a dark room and negotiating, and to bring it to the light, let people understand what the agreement is about, let Parliament understand the agreement and support it. And of course, if IMF includes adequate measures on corruption, that will also have social support and acceptability. But the government could also, I said these are intention. Because it's urgent, the government could tell the IMF, it's really urgent, we don't have time, we are not willing to put anything on corruption. That will, of course, damage social acceptability. It will also damage durability because we know it is macro-critical, or we think it is macro-critical, that actions to mitigate corruption are part of what is important for Sri Lanka's economy and macroeconomy especially to move forward successfully.
So I do gather from what you say that Sri Lanka can't rely on the IMF alone. There's got to be transparency, there's got to be a plan and strategy. What other long-term measures can Sri Lanka take to address its issues in the long run?
So I think the IMF does think about the long run, and that is why they focus on the different budget balance, the trade balance,
Right.
because the trade balance then affects the reserve balance. So these three balances are important. Do you have enough foreign reserves? Is your trade balance negative or positive? And overall, is your capital and current account negative and positive? Is your foreign currency net inflows, outflows? And then is your budget negative or positive, right? So in getting those into place, of course, Sri Lanka has to look at each one. Sometimes if you try to maintain an overvalued currency, your reserves go down, which has happened to Sri Lanka in the past. Trade, we can come to later, but it's often about what we think that the problem is in the borders of other countries. It turns out that the most difficulty exporters have in Sri Lanka is in the Sri Lankan border itself. So there's a concept called trade facilitation, and there are hosts of measures that have been identified, documented, that Sri Lanka can take quite easily and quickly to improve trade facilitation, but hasn't happened for a long time. So those measures are well known, available. Sri Lanka can act on them. They will take a few years to get into place, and that will enormously help exports, and that works for Sri Lanka.
Yeah, that brings me to my next question. Given that Sri Lanka is an import-dependent country, how do you expect the trade deficit to reduce?
So it is import-dependent, but that doesn't stop it from also exporting.
Right.
So there's no problem in being import-dependent, provided you are also exporting such that you can pay for a lot of your imports. So we get foreign currency through several means. I mean, tourism helps foreign currency, worker remittances helps foreign currency even more. Sri Lankans living abroad are sending money back. But then we have to keep growing exports. So exports as a percentage of GDP used to be above 25, almost 30% if you go back 20 years or 22 years. It has fallen over time. So the economy has grown, but it's not an export-led growth. So you can be import-dependent and still have your growth be export-led, and that can solve the problem.
Right. Moving on to the next question. What are there any unnecessary government expenses that need to be cut? Because there are many implying that Sri Lanka has unnecessary government expenses and you need to curtail it.
Yeah, so I think...
Is this a misconception?
So government doesn't spend a lot, but it maybe spends it in the wrong places. So as we know, and everybody reminds us regularly, your defense budget tends to be more than your education and health budget combined at the central government level. Now that's a poor allocation, where society's development and progress depends on education and health, and that needs to get more financing. When you look at the public sector, 50% of salaries and wages goes to the defense salaries and wages. And it turns out that when you look at, how many army military personnel do you have per 100 people, Sri Lanka is ranked 10th in the world, very, very high. We are supporting too many people in that sector. We're almost using it as a welfare scheme. So we can do welfare separately and military recruitment separately. So we can reduce the size of that labor force in the military and actually release them for more productive, economically active work in the country. And that way they also pay taxes, and you reduce the salaries and wages, and you can pay government servants higher salaries. I think that's fine. But perhaps again, we are allocating it wrong. We are paying low salaries and we are putting it into sectors that are not the most useful for growing and contributing to the economy. So I think it is an allocative problem that you have in expenditure more than a total expenditure problem, right? We don't have to cut total expenditure. We can spend more on supporting the poor. But for that, we have to release money from other areas in which we're spending unwisely.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. Moving on to the final question. You said in our previous conversation around 6 months ago that Sri Lanka doesn't have a lot of government revenue, especially due to deep tax cuts in 2019. So the tax cuts in 2019 had cut government revenue by around 25%. How would you suggest we increase government revenue?
So I think your question brings out a very important issue, that any policy measures we take should be driven by analysis, not by ad hoc ideas or thinking
Right,
or
absolutely.
reactions. One of the reasons that we suffered so much was that those tax cuts we implemented had no analysis behind them and didn't recognize the consequences until you got into them and it was too late. Even now, as we reverse those measures, you've heard the government say we're going to go back to 2019 taxes. Now,
as in to increase taxes,
or go back to the higher level of taxation we had in 2019.
right?
But what's interesting is I have not seen any kind of an analysis published by government why that would be a solution. And I can tell you, Verite has a paper that we published. We have something called the Verite Research Sri Lanka Economic Policy Group. It's a group of international and local economists working together to do the analysis. And what we realized is that, for incomes of people in 2019, we had a withholding tax of 5%, and not for companies, but for people, it was considered the final tax. Now, in the reforms that were made, we got rid of withholding tax. So we didn't collect it at all. But we did say that people should declare their whole income, and all their interest income would be taxable at the highest rate that their income was taxable. So effectively, the current tax system asks you to pay more on interest, more taxes on your interest income than the old system. Except that it doesn't do a good job of collecting it because it's removed the withholding tax. It doesn't withhold part of the tax early. So if you go back to that old tax system, people will end up being liable for less taxes because interest rates, as you know, have gone up extremely steeply and today are above 25%. And so the solution, analytically evaluated, seems to be that you should bring back withholding tax not at 5%, even at 10% or higher, and make sure that that is not a final tax, that people are taxable on their interest income to the fullest level that their income is taxable. So this is an example of why analysis is so important. And currently, we have not seen analysis published by government that actually shows what the consequences of the policies that are being adopted are. And if we go forward again without analysis, we may be reinventing the mistake we made in getting into the problem as we try to get out of the problem.
Right. We have come to the end of the conversation. Thank you so much, Dr. de Mel. You answered many pertinent questions and shed light on some very important topics. And I do believe this conversation would be valuable to our audience. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you, Dr. de Mel.
Thank you, Alanki. Great to be with you. Yeah.
It was great to have a second conversation with you. If you have missed my first conversation with Dr. de Mel, do watch it on my YouTube channel. Stay safe, take care, and God bless.